Welcome to TechnoViews, a new series of interviews with major figures in the humanities and social sciences on topics at the intersection between technology, society and culture. And we're focusing mostly on Asia, but also the world writ large. My name is Gonçalo Santos. I'm an assistant professor here at the Hong Kong Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Hong Kong. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Dagmar Schäfer, who has been visiting the Hong Kong Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences, a visiting professor here. She is the director of Department 3, Artifacts, Action and Knowledge of the Max Planck Institute of the History of Science in Berlin. And we're going to have a conversation really about her research. I mean, she's one of the most distinguished scholars working on the history and sociology of China. And I thought one good way to start this conversation is to start talking about your wonderful book, The Crafting of the 10,000 Things, Knowledge and Technology in 17th-Century China, right? Published by the University of Chicago Press in 2011. The book was very well received. I mean, it got all kinds of different awards, right? And, you know, you argue many things, you make many points, but I think one of the strong points that you make in the book, I thought, is that you show how at a certain point in the late Ming dynasty, so we're talking really about the 17th century, there started to emerge a series of publications and writings that were describing existing practices of knowledge and also of technology, and documenting very mundane things like technical procedures of extracting raw materials and processing these raw materials, and also the manufacture of goods that are used in everyday life, from things like paper to ink. One of the things that that strikes me is that you argue that these writings really reflect the flourishing of a uniquely Chinese tradition of thinking about technology and writing about technology. So I think my question is, what would you say are the sort of the main features of this emerging field of scholarly knowledge on technology in the Ming Dynasty period?
Santos, thanks first for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be at the university and to having this interview with you. I'm really enjoying my time here very much. And thank you also for the nice summary of my book. I couldn't have done it any better. The question you are asking is really a very important one, I think, in the field of the history of science. One of the major issues that I was interested in this book is why a person in the 17th century who considers crafts an everyday issue, who sees it every day, once of a sudden becomes interested in writing about it. This seems like an obvious question probably to us today. However, in the culture that existed in this period in the 17th century, literati would usually not engage into such topics. So from this point of view, I think we have a really very exceptional and very nice example here to understand how societies and how individual societies and states probably engage with technology in ways others probably than ours or than in other historical periods. This is important, I believe, because the history of science and technology, and thus also our understanding what scientific and technological development actually means, how it comes about, how we can promote it, what kind of implications it actually has, requires a broader view than it actually has nowadays. So where can we get that view from? I think history is a very good source to look at alternative perspectives. And to add just one sentence to it, I see that the sciences nowadays, especially in Asia, or maybe also in the non-Western world, if you want to use that framing, they tend to see all scientific and technological development very path dependent. They have a specific perspective on how it is actually going to be and what it should be, and what pathways are legitimate ones and justifiable ones and which ones are not, which sciences are important and which are not. And I think here history can really do some very important work.
You mentioned the writers in your response of some of these publications, and of course, you know, many of them were really minor, sort of local officials, you know, who did not really have a distinguished career to many extent. I think one of the interesting things about the book is that you dig a little bit deeper into their motivations and into their biographical trajectories. Could you tell us a little bit about those motivations? I mean, what made you know, minor local officials, such as the history of the famous Tiangong Kai Wu, which is one of the publications that you focus on in the book, you know, what made these officials start to feeling the need to kind of document, sometimes with painstaking detail, you know, some of these technical procedures? What was going on in this period of time?
So certainly, as we all know, their motivations were probably quite different for each and every of them. What we consider to be a minor official, I think, looks very different when you look from the person who writes about it. One of the basic explanations that history would give is this is a petty official who tries to make a point about how important he is and how he can advance innovation or how he can help society. And that rings certainly some bells and also really fits into the historical trajectory. However, I think if you look from the person himself, and Sung Ying is a very nice example for that, then their motivations are probably a little bit different. So in the case of Sung Ying, and I think he was not the only one in his society, in his era, he saw some very substantial truth in these processes. For him, they were a regularity he could rely on, something that would open his eyes about like how nature functions, how society functions, which issues are really important in life. And this is also the perspective, the viewpoint from which he investigated the crafts. So he certainly made a point that other people should listen to him, as many other people nowadays too. But the perspective from which he became interested in the craft and why he valued them was from the perspective of that this is true, reliable knowledge, that this is an issue one should be more concerned about than his time actually was.
Who were the readers of this publication?
Yeah. He didn't have many readers, that's right. The easy answer to it. So his colleagues scorned him for trying to bring technology and cosmology together, so our universal claims to knowledge. And the book became only popular after it was stripped off the cosmological content. And people became more interested in how it transmitted the practices and the techniques. So by the 1700s or 1720s, or probably a little bit earlier, which I could not prove, the book market had this book as a kind of handbook or guidebook, which was useful to it. However, that still doesn't mean that the author initially thought this would be the purpose of his book.
You mentioned a tension between technology and cosmology, which came also, it's sort of very salient as well in your wonderful public lecture that you gave on Tuesday at the Hong Kong Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences. I mean, you're starting a new project. It's on a topic that it's very dear to you, sericulture, and you're documenting historical transitions in the field of knowledge and technology of sericulture, right? And yeah, I mean, I would like to ask you a lot of questions regarding these historical transitions, but perhaps I would start by asking you a question about, you know, why this interest in sericulture? Because I think you mentioned that this is a topic that it's very dear to you. Yeah. And, you know, when was the first time that you started to become interested in sericulture? And, you know, what did this interest do to you, to your research? What new insights it brought to your research?
I did actually not become interested in sericulture, but my professor made me study it very early in my career. And I believe at that point in time, I really did not understand the implications of doing this. So when Dieter Kuhn asked me to do some research on the Ming dynasty, I did a very traditional study, I would say, on the history of technology and economic change through state manufacturing. So by that time, the government really took charge of sericulture and textile production. And it's only in the last 4 or 5 years that I more and more realized that I've underestimated this topic and that I should go back to it to ask one of the, I think for me at the moment, very important questions in the history of science. How can we understand sciences and scientific development in regions that have historically developed differently to what we know has been a successful scientific change in Europe or in the modern world since the 19th century or the 20th century? And what would be a possible topic to study that? Because we certainly cannot study everything. One of the, I think, the sub-questions that interests me, which you can see also reflected in the name of my department, Artifacts, Action and Knowledge, is the way in which practices, but also the materiality of being is related to it. So if you look at Chinese culture, they identify very thoroughly, very deeply with sericulture. It's also, even if they would not identify with it, so the state and the government historically always engaged very strongly with this sericulture production. It dominated life cycles, it dominated daily work, it was central to ritual politics and the like. They also thought a lot with and through the way in which sericulture functioned. So my question was, when I look at scientific development and I think about the materiality of being at a certain place through time, how does the one influence the other? And that makes sericulture the perfect topic to think through these questions and how that changes in the scientific development and in the context of looking at scientific and technological development, or the change of knowledge and how it impacts development to the worse or to the better. There is so much documentation that has not yet been looked at thoroughly from this particular perspective. When did people think about sericulture in different way? How did they think about it in different way? How did that impact their idea about, for instance, health, about time, about spatial context, for instance? And what of that did they consider important?
Right, yeah. And one of the historical transition, I don't like very much the term transition, but let's put it the shifts that occurred in the period that you are talking about, which is mostly the Yuan Ming, shift, and also the Ming Qing kind of, period. And you document a moment in which we see that the field of sericulture is still largely built around a very cosmological framework in which the silkworm, of course, plays a central role. And we have all these kinds of publications and illustrations that highlight the centrality of the silkworm to a situation in which what becomes the core of the central point of attention is rather the technical procedures, the fiber, and the fabric. Would you say that this is also a shift from cosmology to technology?
I think it's not that easy. I'm currently doing a comparison with my dear colleague Giorgio Riello, who is an expert in cotton production and how it changed the world from the 16th century onwards. And he's shifting interest to silk in a sense too. And we look at this relation of different materialities in different contexts. So what I've learned really from him is that when you compare these treatises, then you see there is actually not much difference in the content. All of these treatises describe the same way. And this is also true for the entire Chinese chronology. So from a certain point of view, what they describe is always the same. The cycle of production, the way in which you actually produce a weavable thread, the way in which you degum the silk, so very technical things. But the way in which they frame it and why they want to know it, this changes quite dramatically. So even with the cosmological framing that you find in the earlier text, you find a quite clear, excellent technical description of the processes of production or the processes of use, which is, I think, also a very important point. In some periods, production is really important. In other periods, the entire cycle of the silkworm, from basically the food it needs, from the nutrition it needs, down to the final uses of the textiles are produced. And in others, just some instances are looked at. So two of the things that you can see is that throughout all these periods, the idea of practices is quite central to this field, but how it is connected to people making claims about how valuable and what kind of knowledge that actually is and where it belongs in their society, this changes quite dramatically. And this is what I mean with the cosmological framing to the interest in the technology or the practices as such. So at some point, cosmology gets stripped off and it becomes the transmission of the practices becomes the major purpose of these writings, which I think really in the European context, as much as I've learned through this comparative research with my colleague, this is something that stands at the beginning of the European engagement with such themes.
Interesting, yeah. And of course, one of the, larger implications of that kind of historical narrative is that you are rewriting in many ways the history of Imperial China. I mean, given that you are introducing a technological and scientific perspective. Dominant frameworks of historiography and sinology certainly are largely dominated by a method of classification that relies to a very large extent on dynasties and dynastic periods, right? And I think one of the things that you were actually suggesting on Tuesday at your public lecture, if I understood you correctly, is that you, focus on, what is going on at the level of existing forms of knowledge and technical procedures in a specific field, in your case is sericulture, may actually upset, generate a new way of looking at history that does not necessarily overlap with, the dynastic kind of framework. So I'm kind of tempted to ask you, of course, this is a very important finding, and I'm tempted to ask you about the larger implications of this finding. I mean, especially in relationship to, the broader field of historical studies of technology and innovation. I mean, this mismatch between the pace of technology and the pace of dynastic history.
Yeah, I think this also really, it connects to a couple of issues that are going on in the field of history of technology and science. I usually use, I should really say, the term science as a kind of umbrella term for science, technology, and medicine. I'm really coming out of the practical tradition more, where you can see that people operate with terms such as the technosciences to show that practices and theoretical considerations always go hand in hand. There is also a great interest in, when you understand other cultures like Asia, what that means methodologically. And I think this is one really major concern for me too. A couple of historians of technology have embraced that with the term Asia as a method. I think what it actually means is not that one region should now turn into a new method, but that we should take serious what we learn from the history of other periods and be very careful what kind of classifications and analysis we are doing. so that the gaze is not dominated by the modern perspective, that it's not dominated by experiences that have been made in other periods, in other areas. And I think an anthropologist and a sociologist would understand that very well. So these two trends, I think, speak very much to the current trend in the history of science and technology, and medicine too, and to the necessity also to rethink, envisage our modern ideas about, think about the world as being one that has many scientific areas, but all what scientists do nowadays is working inter and transdisciplinary. These are the most cutting edge fields in the sciences nowadays. So it shows us that people always struggle with classifications. They always try to find new configurations. And I think it's the historian's task to engage with these configurations seriously and to look at them as a possible source to understand what has historically happened, or maybe also sometimes give us another perspective to the modern world.
Right, yeah. You mentioned the term materiality on a couple of occasions in your responses. And, you know, as an anthropologist, I'm very, very interested in materialities as well. And I think that one of the greatest innovations of your research is methodological, because you're not just looking at historical documents, you know, and it's not the kind of, you know, more conventional archival research. You're actually doing a lot of research with artifacts, and you're asking questions like, you know, how can artifacts speak? And you know, even asking questions, how can the silkworm, you know, speak? You know, it's just very sort of familiar questions for people who are in the social sciences and humanities, who are engaging with the material turn, with the so-called material turn. Would you situate your research in relationship to this larger interest in the humanities and social sciences towards issues at the intersection of natural forces, material regimes, and systems of power? Would you kind of situate yourself in this kind of larger trend?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think this is really also one of the hot topics that the historians really need to engage with more seriously, because different to the sociologists or the anthropologists, our sources are mostly death. Yeah, so whether we now analyze them through scientific or through historical means, there is only a certain selection of things that we can look at. We cannot go back at the scene and really understand what is going on. A couple of years ago, there was a really very good roundtable at the Society for the History of Technology, where Martin Collins reminded us all how material culture turn is connected to Marxism, to materialism, this materialism debate, but also to the material culture turn that has happened in museum studies. So you could say that looking from a history of technology point of view into that, a theme that once has been very deterministic and socially laden, very difficult to interpret, has turned into a new chance to let objects speak, or to think about this loaded term of non-human agency. So the way in which humans impact their environment, how this plays out at one point as a material condition, a condition with consequences that they have not always thought through, and that many people then at least reflect upon as if the materiality would have an agency on them, because it forces them to do things that they cannot control themselves. That's, I think, a part of the, I wouldn't use the term agency, but it's a part of the materiality studies concern, or this new trend that I think is very important, to think about how the materiality that we have shaped also shapes us, and how it talks back to us. And then there is certainly this big topic that I'm only delving into, because I think that in Asian studies, historically, could have achieved more attention. So I hope that more researchers go into it, namely the non-human animals. So the question of how animals actually tell us a history in a way that makes us, or in also participated in history in a way that we should consider more deeply.
Right. Is it possible to write a history of sericulture from the perspective of the silkworm?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. That would also not be my ultimate aim. But to consider that the sericulture worm, the sericulture, the silkworm, is a really great topic to see how humans engage with animals and turn it into an artifact. It's a very artificial system in which the silkworm can actually only maintain. You see it nowadays in that silk is very difficult to produce in China, that a lot of places have difficulties because of pollution, that it impacts the mulberry trees. All these kind of things are quite important. They throw another light on the animal actor in history. There are certainly much more obvious actors. Others would choose the horse, but we also know from nowadays science that the disappearance of the bees and the insects is a substantial topic. So I hope that in due course of my research, also with new scientific methods, I can get a better grasp about the silkworm's own materiality and how it shapes the human, because the human accepted it, or worked with it. How deep I can actually go depends a lot on the sources that I can find.
Right, yeah. You're not just studying materials and non-human actors. You're also a collector, right? You're also a collector. You collect many things, and one of them is you have been collecting local gazetteers.
Yeah.
Local gazetteers, which of course for those of you in the audience that do not know what local gazetteers are, they are basic sources of information on local forms of knowledge and also technical procedures. They are local histories in a way. So you've been collecting thousands of local gazetteers, and you have been scanning them and basically building a database at the Max Planck Institute in Berlin. And as I understand, this is part of a larger research theme on histories of planning. Could you tell us a little bit about this this local gazetteer project?
I need to correct you a little bit, because I'm not digitizing these sources myself. Rather, at many places in the world, this genre of local gazetteers, so officials over actually from the 9th century up until the present day, writing local documentation of the locality, collecting very pragmatically information about taxes, people, architecture, trying to explain to the next person who comes to the office what this place is like and which resources it actually has. So all these sources have been collected in different databases, and what our database does, and it's not really a database, is a system that tries to allow a person to look through these databases together and to understand how local materiality is created through this genre. You must imagine that an official, when he sat down every 20 years, or a compiler's team got together to compile this source, they had to go according to a structure. And so they looked at the previous text, and then they looked what was there, and then they wrote down what they considered to be the result. Very interesting in the Chinese context, literati often, or very, very quickly, more adhered to the text and thus defined what the local materiality actually should be, rather than only recording what was there. So they took a literature knowledge to define a locality's identity. We do that nowadays actually also quite often. We look at Hong Kong and we have our tour guide, and we expect that this special building will be here, that the market will be here, and just that the turnover nowadays is probably for a lonely planet half a year, and then it was 20 years, and it was also meant to be very important. So I'm very interested in this already present database as a possibility to understand how literature and materiality and the material identity of a place were connected or not. So the ultimate aim of this tool that we are building is to look on the one hand on the literature, but also to look at the materiality itself, at the locality, and ask questions about what kind of knowledge was considered important, which impact did it had, how did people really maintain these structures, what did they consider to preserve, when did they admit to the fact that such issues were no longer producible at this place because the resources were no longer accessible, the climate had changed, all these issues. And I think this is very important because a lot of history of science research in my field of expertise, so in China, concentrates on the elite and scholarly state view, because many of our sources are from this elite and state view. These local gazetteers are certainly also, but they offer us a much more diversified view of a local perspective, what these places actually are, and what may have been, to some extent, also defined the everyday culture.
Right, yeah, that's a great way to actually end this conversation. When are you going back to Berlin?
Tomorrow,
You're
unfortunately.
flying tomorrow. Well, I wish you a good flight, so thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. Thanks for watching. My name is Gonçalo Santos at the University of Hong Kong. What you just saw is the second episode of TechnoViews, a new online platform broadcasting interviews with major scholars on topics at the intersection between technology, society, and culture in Asia and the world.